Hello! It's Saturday, which means it's study day. And we're gonna continue with our course for learning, eventually, first order logic. First order classical logic, to be more precise. In our series of getting into mathematical logic. So last week we ended on this, the homework, and I made most of it. I made this part. I did 1.5 and 1.6, but especially 1.8 onwards is good streaming material. We'll see why, because it is not the proof will not be done through an effective procedure. It will be a very simple, but nevertheless a real mathematical proof. Anyways, what else did we see last week? Oh yeah, we saw... Okay, we had the basics of semantics. We went over truth tables and how to fill in the space of the symbols. Basically, in a very broad and unsatisfying way, we asked, what do these symbols mean? And their meaning, their semantics, is that they occupy some sort of grid, space. Strictly speaking, a Boolean algebra or ring of sorts. And we decided by fiat, by imposition, by just to get this machinery running, that the big capital letters, those are going to be our propositions, and those were going to be either true or false, and always true or false. We thus assigned these letters a truth function. And a function we saw was a very special type of mathematical relationship between two sets, such that the elements of the first set sent you to one and only one element of the other set, which we call the image or codomain, and the first set we call the domain. An element from the second set can receive multiple elements from the first, but the domain, since all of the pieces of the domain sends you to one and only one element of the codomain or image. And a truth function is a function that assigns propositions to a truth value. In our logic, in classical propositional logic, which is what we're studying, it sends you to either true or false, and it has to send you into either one of those. As such, we saw a method for mapping out every possible combination or every possible truth function that can be assigned to a more complex formula. And this visual mapping out of all possible combinations we call a truth table. We also saw that we can have more complex formula built not just from propositions, but from these things we call logical connectives, which is like that arrow you see on screen, and also that twisted L shape, which we just call the negation symbol, that weirdly angular V, or rather the bottom triangle, and the top pointing triangle. We saw what are the conditions for making those symbols. Well, the truth functions of these symbols. We saw that the top pointing triangle, aka the conjunction, is only true when both of the elements it joins together are true. the disjunction when either one of the elements is true, or even both, and so on and so on. So now we also have our language, our formal language expressed, and we learn how to start doing things with it. We learn how to do these mappings, and we saw that even with this primitive set of functions, we can express some mathematical relationships between propositions and formula in general, which allow us to express some very basic mathematical principles, such as extrapolation or things used in, for example, medieval scholastics, as valid methods for analyzing truth, such as excluded middle, and so on and so on. So we can now do things with our little basic propositional language. We mostly know how to map out the truth conditions for formula. And we learned almost at the end of last session that when certain formulas are true, no matter what the truth function assigns, what value the truth function assigns to the elements of the formula, such as they are true no matter what, we call those formulas tautologies. And a tautology at first glance sounds pretty cool. I mean, hey, it's basically an eternal truth. It's an eternal truth inside our system relative to the rules we set out. So we get eternal truths out of the things we put in the system. So it's not as hype as it sounds. But anyways, formula that are always true no matter what reveal the basic structure and suppositions of the system we are in. One of the basic tautologies of this system of propositional logic is something we saw called the law of excluded middle, or third excluded, which is things either are or they are not in the system. Those are the only two options, to be or not to be. This type of mathematical thinking does not recognize things such as more or less true, mostly the case, or somewhat the case. There's no vagueness, no middle terms, nothing. It's binary. You either are or you're not. And that type of thinking is extremely useful in a frozen, unchanging plane of the mind, such as mathematics. But it's not so useful in other spaces or avenues of action. Another tautology or logical principle in this system is the law of non-contradiction. In this system, if you have A and not A, something is and is not at the same time, well, in this system, things are either true or false. So A is either true or false. Negation inverts the symbols. If something is true, the negation is false. And if something is false, the negation is true. So in this system, can something be and not be in the same way at the same time, just like Aristotle said? No. This statement is always false. It's a contradiction. A contradiction is the opposite of a tautology, at least in this perspective or in this paradigm. So, if they're opposites and the negation switches, negating a contradiction gives us something that is always true. So A and not A is always false. Saying no to that is always true. So this is how this system expresses the law of non-contradiction, which is only a law if you believe in it. But that is a more of a... Why are you taking away my selection tool? Oh, because it's in text selection tool, not... Okay. Yeah, that's more like of a philosophy of logic thing, which is perfectly valid to go over and useful too. I don't want people thinking that the claims of classical logicians such as Frege are neutral and without complaint or questioning. They absolutely are. The people who made classical logic, they had some very strong ideas about what the role of logic should be. Boole called it the laws of thought. So yeah, a bit of a totalizing mode of thinking. Anyways, so with all these methods that we have for evaluating formulas through their truth functions, we had some homework. Here it is, the first part. So this is the 1.5. So okay, already need to backtrack. Determine whether the following are tautologies. So tautologies, remember, are formulas which are always true. Another way of calling this, some mathematicians or logicians call them valid under the model, which is more of a handful to say, but I think it's more honest because it explicitly relativizes that this is true or always true or valid. Yeah, but under this model, under this logic. Okay, so now we can go to the homework. So the first formula was if A implies B, if all of that, then B. And for the first three exercises, I just did the truth table. As long as we have A and B, just two symbols, the truth tables are 4 rows deep, 4 rows long. I don't know what the correct terminology is. And that's really simple and easy to map out. So A implies B, all of that implies B. I started filling out the proposition letters, the A's and the B's, under the canonical order. A appears first, so we go true, true, false, false. B appears second, so we go true, false, true, false. So we have A implies B, which at this point, I hope everyone has memorized that under the canonical order, it is just true, false, true, true, because the only combination that makes a material conditional or implication false is when the antecedent, or the first part, or the sufficient cause is true, and the consequent, or the second part, or the necessary cause is false. So the only row that is odd is true, true first, false second. That gives me false. Everywhere else is true. And that implies B. Well, B is true, false, so true implies true, yes. False implies false, yes. True implies true, yes. False implies false, no. And then we have B again. True implies true, yes. True implies false, false. And I'm done. As long as I can find one set or one assigned truth value to the proposition letters that gives me false on the main connective, which is the last formula to join and to generate and to evaluate this combination or this built-up formula, I'm done. We have a counterexample. This formula is false or can be made false in at least one modular combination, which is when A is true and B is false. That will give me a true antecedent and a false consequent. So no, B is not implied by A implies B implies B. Very similar case with the second formula. A implies B implies B. Does that imply A? No. The first, like this part is the same as above, so I could just copy and paste. And then instead of true, false, I have true, true, false, false. And again, I have one scenario in which the first part gives me true, and the second part gives me false. So true implies false, that is false. That is not valid. But now I have A implies B implies A, and that implies A. That is actually valid. Because A implies B implies A is equivalent to A. And of course, A implies A. I know they're equivalent because they have the same result in the truth table, in the same order. For the fourth exercise, I decided to do a different method. We saw this method at the end of the last session as well, where instead of doing the full truth table, we just go, okay, what will need to happen for the main connective, which is this implication, to be false? Let's see if I can make a false model out of this. Well, not a false model, like, let me be precise. A truth function which makes this formula false. So if I want to make this false, because it's a conditional, I need to make the first part true and the second part false. In order to make the second part false, I will need to make A true and B false. So I have assigned values here. That's why they are all in the third row. So in order to make this formula false, I need to make the consequent false. In order to make the consequent false, I need to make A true and B false. It is recursive analysis. Recursion is the name of the game here. So if I have A true and B false, then this is also false, because it's the same formula. A implies B. So because I want to make this true, I need to make this false. But I have also assigned B, because B has to be false from this reasoning. Then false implies whatever, I don't care. The only case in which a conditional can be false is in which B is true and C is false. But since B has to be false, then this conditional has to be true, which means I cannot make this conditional true, because then I have this true and this false, which means I have this true and false at the same time. That is a contradiction. Therefore, it is impossible to make this formula false. Therefore, it has to be valid. B implies C implies A implies B implies A implies B. When you get like a lot of practice doing this, and I've been doing this for years, you can develop like an intuition. Again, okay, I have to make this false. This implication has to be false. Okay, so I just assign A to be true, because I don't want to care about all this. As long as A is true, this disjunction is true, and I have to make this false. And because this is a disjunction, I have to make both sides false. Well, in order to make both sides false, I have to make B false. And I already assigned true to A, so this has to be true. And so this is false. False or false, false. Look! I have a model or a truth assignment in which I can make the antecedent true and the consequent false. There is no contradiction, which means this formula is not valid or not tautological. A implies that B implies A. Okay? Again, this is the main connective, so I have to make this part true and this part false. So A has to be true. This has to be true because I want in order for this to be false, I need to assign the antecedent true, the consequent false. This is the consequence, so this has to be false, which means that I have to assign B true, so both formulas are true. But in order for this to be false, I need to assign true and false. I have A assigned simultaneously to both true and false. That is impossible under propositional logic, which means I cannot assign this symbol in this formula falsehood, which means this formula is valid. A and B implies A or C. Intuitively, this makes sense because if A and B is true, fuck, I didn't finish the homework. I will do this next one. It's okay, Rupert. You don't need to do the homework every week, but you need to do the homework. Because logic is not just about learning passively, it's about rewiring some part of your brain to think differently, to engage in highly abstract mathematical thinking as an active, continuous verb, not just as something you know, but as something you do. I'm doing the truth table practice, so that's great. Good. Okay, so yeah, this is 1.5 from Mendelssohn. The exercise is in 1.5. And I was saying that this formula is intuitively valid. It has to be the case because in order for A and B to be true, A has to be true. And if A is true, then A or whatever is true. C is irrelevant. Because a disjunction is true as long as one part is true, and I already know that A is true, so a more intuitive example will be I have burgers and fries. If I have burgers and fries, that implies that I have burgers or pizza. Yeah, I mean, trivially, because I have burgers. So if I have burgers, then I have burgers or pizza. Hey, do you actually have pizza? No, but I have burgers. And that is enough to say I have burgers or pizza. I have a blue shirt or a black shirt. Yeah, because I only have black shirts. So it's technically true. It's a bit misleading, but formal logic and mathematical thinking does not care about misleading. It only cares about being technically true. Okay, and in this exercise from 1.5, let me check. It is H. The one with the V conditionals. So A implies B is equivalent to A if and only if. No, this is not A implies B, I'm sorry. This is A is equivalent to B if and only if A is equivalent to B is equivalent to A. This is not valid. I don't know why I didn't put the result. A if and only if B. Sorry, something. Yeah, sorry, something here. No, it's still there. Okay, there we go. So A, if and only if B is, at this point, I hope we all heard it memorized. It is true only when both have the same value, which is true, false, false, true. B, if and only if A is the same as A, if and only if B. It's a symmetrical connective, so T, F, F, T, true, false, false, true. But that is if and only if A. True is the same as true? Yes. True is the same as false? No. False is the same as false? Yes. False is the same as true? No. So TFFT, TFTF, which means this is equivalent to B, they are not the same, so they will have, whoa, what did I do? Some odd or false results. So false is the same as true, false, and it's not valid. A implies B or B implies A. Yeah, this is another counterintuitive result if you want your propositional or first order logic to be like meaningful, or if you want the material conditional to be anything other than just a mathematical relationship, because this means that for every two propositions or for every two statements or for every two well-formed facts that you can think of, one implies the other. A implies B or B implies A, and this is valid. So A implies B is TFTT, B implies A is TTFT. So at least one of them is true, yes. 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 And then we have, what did I do here? The last one, which is the negation of this implication implies A. This is intuitively valid. Why? Because in order for this negation to be true, the implication has to be false. And the implication is only false when the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. So not implication guarantees the truth of the antecedent, and the antecedent is A. So if this negation is true, A has to be true, which means true implies true. So it has to be true. If you're not comfortable using these quicker, slightly more tricky methods, it's fine to do the truth table. We can do this really quickly. True, true, false, false, true, false, true, false, true, true, false, false, true, false, true, true, false, true, false, false, true, 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 true. Because the only way this is false is when something is true here, but false here. And the only space in which this is true, which is the negation of the implication, A is also true, therefore the same reasoning that we just did, but more explicit. Thus, this formula is valid. Okay, so that was section 1.15. Let us go to 1.16. (1.16) tells us, determine whether the following pairs are logically equivalent. And the only method we have for proving logical equivalence so far is making a truth table in which the main connective joins, in which the biconditional as a main connective, joins both formulas. So A implies B all of that implies A, if and only if A. Why? Because the deconditional is just an equivalence. It says I'm only true when both of these values match. So logical equivalence is rescued by design by a connective that maps out equivalences. That is what the connective was put in the system to do. It's not a lot of depth involved. So if we want to prove that A implies B, that implies A is equivalent to A, we build this. We put the first formula and the second formula, and we put a B conditional in the middle. So A implies B, TFTT, all of that implies A. True implies true, yes. False implies true, yes. True implies false, no. True implies false, no. So we have TTFF, which is the same mapping as A. So of course it's going to be equivalent. True is the same as true, true is the same as true, false is the same as false, and so on, so on. Therefore, this is just a very confusing and long-winded way of saying A. So if you want to bullshit someone, you can just say, well, turns out that if we fail our reports, then we will crash. If that is true, then we fail our reports. What the hell? Yeah, well, it turns out that saying all of that is just the same as saying we failed the reports. The same as A. Okay, same method for the next exercise. A if and only if B is equivalent to A implies B and B implies A. This is also intuitively true. This is also why we call this symbol or this function the B conditional, because it's two conditionals. A is equivalent to B if and only if A implies B and B implies A, such that if there's A, there's B, and if there's B, then there's A. So it's a way of saying they're buddies. And yes, of course, this will map out to be always true, therefore a tautology, therefore a valid schema for reasoning under our system. A if and only if B is TFFT. A implies B is TFTT. B implies A is TTFT. When are both formulas true? True and true, yes. False, false. True and false, false. True and true, true. So we have TFFT, TFFT. They are the same sequence, therefore the equivalence will show that they have the same values and thus are always true. They are equivalent. Not A or B is equivalent to not B or A? No. So in this case, I skipped doing the A part. I already know that A is TTFF. So the negation of A, that is just FFTT, the inversion. I'm just cutting one step here. I'm taking some shortcuts because at this point I have done this so many times that my brain can just do it on automatic. And that is why it's important to do the homework. Once you do this hundreds of times, your brain will learn to do this in a very intuitive, efficient way. And that is something I want to mention, like a brief parenthesis, but mathematical insight is not innate. It is something you can train. When you do these kinds of exercises hundreds of times, what appears to you as spontaneous, intuitive vibes will change. Vibes are not natural. They are trained behavior. Do something long enough and your immediate, spontaneous appreciation or feeling of a situation will change according to that practice. Anyways, this idea of doing the same exercise hundreds, thousands of times, such that you can just develop this kind of thinking, of thinking counterexamples, thinking whether something follows or not, is a practice as old as ancient Greece. Medieval scholastics did this all the time. They had technology for training their memories. Anyways, if B is true, false, then the negation of B is false, true, false, true. So this will give me true, true, false, true, because the only place in which both are false is this one. And are they the same sequence? No. True and true, yes, same. False and true, not the same. Therefore, not equivalent. Rupert says, I've been trying to make conscious all those little behaviors and all the recursive loops make themselves more apparent. The truth tables have been already helping me through the tautology practices next step. Yep. Yeah, recursion is so crucial to logical thinking that one of the ways of defining what a computer is and can do is through recursive functions. Like basically saying, yeah, a computer is this family of recursive functions. Anything that can do this family of recursive functions is a computer. That is the Church definition, the Alonso Church definition of computing. Contrast to the Turing one, which involves the Turing machine. Okay, so not A if and only if B is the same as A if and only if not B. Yes, intuitively this will be valid. Because what does the negation do? It inverts. So equivalence, true, false, false, true, switch, F, T, T, F. A if and only if not B, well, the B switches. So instead of being true, false, it's false, true. So true is the same as false? No. True is the same as true? Yes. False is the same as false? Yes. False is the same as true? No. And so we have F, T, T, F on both sides, therefore they are equivalent. So yes, saying that it is not true that Alice is always in the same place as Bob is the same as saying, at least in this logic, that Alice will only be in a place when Bob is not there, and vice versa. Bob will only be in a place when Alice is not there. This is also another way of defining the exclusive disjunction. Either one of them, but never both. Okay. These are a little longer. They are 8 rows long. But it's still the most quickest, laziest way to prove equivalences. So A or B if and only if C, if and only if A or B. Okay, no, I read it wrong. A or B if and only if A or C is the same as A or B if and only if C. Intuitively, this also makes sense. Because this formula is saying either A or B always with C. So either I have A or B or A or C. If and only if. Either A is true, in which case this is true, therefore this is true, or B and C together, in which case if B is true, then C will be true as well, B is false, C will be false as well. If this is equivalent to this. And so here we go. Because we have 3 proposition letters, we need 4 more rows, 8. And so the canonical order is A has 4 truths and 4 false, B has 2 and 2, 2 and 2, and C, the third term, is true, false, true, false, true, false, true, false, and so on. We build this be conditional, true, true. Okay, it's basically just, yeah, true, false, false, true, true, false, false, true, which is this same pattern, but repeated. So this disjunction will be true always in the first 4 rows, because A is true in the first 4 rows. So I don't even need to look at this. It's just true, true, true. And this, the remaining 4 rows, will only be true when B, if and only if C are true. So the first 4 rows copy the structure of A, and the bottom 4 rows copy the structure of B, if and only if C. Then we go to this part. Again, the structure in the first 4 rows is true because in A or B or A or C, in the first 4 rows, A is true, so true, 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 true. Then we have that in the 4 bottom rows, it copies the structure of the other half. In these 4 rows, it copies the structure of B. In these 4 rows, it copies the structure of C. Am I getting through? Is the structure apparent? That this mapping out mirrors the idea that this formula is either A or it is B if and only if C, and the first 4 rows are the case in which A and the bottom 4 rows are the case in which this. So the bottom 4 rows are functionally B if and only if C, and therefore they will have the structure TFFT, which is this structure again. So of course they will be equivalent. In the first 4 rows they're equivalent because A is true, and the bottom 4 rows they will be equivalent because B if and only if C. Let me take a sip. Okay, then we have A implies B if and only if C. So very similar to the previous one, except that instead of disjunction, we have conditionals. I know that a conditional is equivalent to. Okay, I'll think I'll type this out over here. In fact, fuck it. I'll make it. Not A or B, if and only if A implies B. Okay. Also, notice. No, wait. I'm doing this all wrong. It's this. Also, notice that the order of parentheses is very important. Parenthesis negation is very different than negation parenthesis. Because here, this negation is negating A. If I were to type this, I will be negating this disjunction. So just like programming, the order of and hierarchy of parentheses and operations is very important. In fact, I think it's the same principle. I think that parentheses in programming are important because you are describing the order of operations. So not A or B is equivalent to A implies B. So we do the same canonical order: true, 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 false, false, true, false, true, false, true, false, true, true. And then we have true, true, false, false, which means false, false, true, true. Oops, true, true, false, true, false, false and true, true, false and false or false, false, true or true, true, true or false, true. As long as one side is true, the disjunction is true. Therefore, I have TFTT, TFTT. They are the same. True, 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 true. So this exercise and this exercise are basically the same, except that in this case, this A implies I can also see it as a not A or. So it's going to be the same structure, but flipped. Instead of the first 4 rows being about A, it's going to be the bottom 4 rows being about A. But we'll do it thoroughly anyways. I just want to share that insight. A implies something. Well, I know that in the bottom 4 rows, A is false. And a conditional cannot be false if the antecedent is false. Therefore, as long as A is false, this conditional is automatically true. Wait, no, this one. This one, this one, and this one. And because it's all through here and it's all through here, then the equivalence will also be all through here. See, so these 4 bottom rows are automatically true when A is false. Because the bottom 4 rows are the spaces in which A is false in the canonical order: true, true, false, false, and so on, so on. So see, it is the same structure, but inverted, negated. Remember that negation, it's more useful to think about like a switch. It inverts stuff. So now I have B if and only if C, TFFT, and it's these 4 rows will only be false when the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. So true implies false, false, true implies false, false. TFFT, TFFT, the same structure. Now we go to this side. The bottom 4 rows all automatically true because A implies whatever, as long as A is false. And then we have A implies B, as long as B is true, therefore TTFF, true, true, false, false. A implies C, as long as C is true, true, false, true, false. A implies B if and only if A implies C. Well, in the bottom rows, yes, all true. They are both true. In the first 4 rows, that is only true when either both B and C are true or both B and C are false, which is TFFT, which is the same as here, which means we have an equivalence. Yeah, the interesting or the very extra work is to notice those structures, because that points to an underlying pattern, to a set of mathematical relationships that are very beautiful to behold. And I think this is the final exercise of this section, 1.6. So we have A and, okay, basically very similar to this one, but with conjunction instead of disjunction. So it's not going to be equivalent because the conjunction is a lot more demanding. So this formula is telling me A and B if and only if C. this formula is automatically going to be false in the 4 bottom rows, because in the 4 bottom rows, A is false, and both sides need to be true. So here again, this is going to be false because A is false, therefore the conjunction is false. A is false, therefore the conjunction is going to be false. So we have some of the same structure, but we'll see what happens. So A and B if and only if C, okay? So this is true only when B if and only if C is true. So we have TF, FT. The problem is that A and B if and only if A and C, okay, we have the same structure on top. But because this is an if and only if, it's going to give us true in these 4 stages, because in these 4 rows, sorry, because these 4 rows are both false, false, therefore they're going to give us true here and false here, which means they do not match. So all of this is not equivalent, but all of this can be reduced to true, 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 false, 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 which is the same mapping as A. All of this giant chorizo of a formula is another really fancy way of saying A. Okay, then we have the juicy bits, the ones I want to do on stream. Our first mathematical proofs. They're going to be very simple, but I think that developing the notion of what a mathematical proof is the single most useful skill you can get from learning propositional logic, or any formal system whatsoever. No, I want select text. Okay, so we need to prove that A implies B is logically equivalent to A. Okay, we already did that. Yeah, we did that over here. Fancy chorizo rolling my hands like a fly. So yeah, this is not a mathematical proof by itself, but if I explain to someone, hey, the definition of this symbol is that it will only signal something is true when both sides of this operation are true at the same time. Therefore, because I have this complete exhaustive mapping out, that in every case in which A implies B is true is also the case in which not A or B is true. Every case in which A implies B is false is also every case in which not A or B is false, because they have always the same values. Then they have to be logical equivalent. Because my definition of logical equivalence, I'm going to need it. Because my definition of logical equivalence is in which every truth assignment that makes a formula true is the same as what makes the other formula true, and vice and contrary-wise. When one is false, the other is false. See? So by proving that these two formulas, that these formulas joined together by a biconditional, they are a tautology, I have proven that A implies B is logically equivalent to not A or B. And I can do a very similar reasoning here. A implies B is logically equivalent to it's not true that A and not B. This is even more simple because, I mean, I can do the truth table, I guess, but when is the only case in which a conditional is false? When the antecedent, in this case A elevated to a variable, is true, and the consequent, in this case B, is false. When is not B true? When B is false. So not B is only true when B is false, and vice versa. Therefore, A and not B is a representation or a formula equivalent to the only case in which A implies B is false. Therefore, if I negate the only case in which this formula is false, I get something equivalent to this formula. That is a mathematical proof. I mean, I can still do the truth table, but most mathematical proofs will not be done through truth tables. They will be done through a sequence of reasonings, very much like the one I just gave. It's a very simple baby proof, but what is important is getting people familiarized with the notion of what is an okay mathematical proof. And to make it even more so, prove that Gothic B is logically equivalent to Gothic C if and only if B logically implies C, Gothic C, and C logically implies B. Now, because this is not a formula of my language, Gothic V is not a defined element of our language. We did not define any Gothic B. This Gothic B is a variable, a joker card if you want to picture it that way, that stands for any well-formed formula of our language. I'm doing algebra at a higher level of abstraction. This is not just a formula, it's any formula at all. And therefore, my proof cannot be done within the system. It has to be a chain of reasonings about my system that I can only produce once I am more or less familiar with the rules of my system. But the proof will not be inside the system. I am doing reasonings about my reasoning. I am doing something called metalogic. Very important. Metalogic is not expressed in the language of my logic. Metalogic, as the name implies, is one step above in my chain of abstractions. Yes, the Gothic metafont. So I'm going to produce a text document That's what the Gothic font means? Yeah, the Gothic font is just a visual shorthand for saying this is... the correct term is metavariable. A variable of all variables. I know it's confusing, but yeah. Again, think of it like some sort of joker card. What is the value of a joker card? Any card. It can take the shape of any other card. Hold on, I'm having some issues because of the Gothic thing. I think I don't have an adequate font on my okay, found a way to do this. You know, one thing I'm really liking of doing this whole streaming thing is that if I ever do classes online in a academic setting, I'm way more ready to do so in a more professional sort of way. Okay, so prove that beta is logically equivalent to she if and only if beta logically implies she and beta logically. And oops, I fucked this up. And she logically implies B. Okay? So we have to type this out. We can use the insights of what we have done and familiarized with so far, but we have to write out our reasoning. And this reasoning needs to be sound, and it needs to be mathematically solid. Okay, so I need to prove an if and only if. So I need to prove that whoops. What is it? Faithful. I need to prove it in this direction. And then I need to prove in the other direction. It's liberation set if. Son of a. Okay, I'll just do it the lazy way. Okay, so because I have to prove an if and only if, I already learned that an if and only if is just two conditionals, A going to B and B going to A. So I need to prove these two things. Out of these two, the second one is way easier, but so I just type it out. In order to prove an if and only if statement, I will prove both conditions by separate. And I can get cutesy and say, this is just, I mean, let's just say this is 1.1. and I say this is 1.2. Okay, and then I have to use the greatest weapon I told you all when doing the essay streams. I need to do logical analysis. What does every part of this sentence mean? If beta is logically equivalent to she, what does beta being logically equivalent to she mean? It means that I go back to the book and check again the definition of logical equivalence. If two formulas are logically equivalent, then every truth assignment that makes the first one true also makes the second one true. Hell, I'll just copy and paste that part. Of course, without Greeking out. See, this, I've just broken down what logical equivalent means into a simpler set of words and meaning. Since these two formulas have the same truth value under the correspondent truth assignments, then there can't be the case in which beta is true and chi is false. As that will contradict our premise. Likewise with the other implication. We have already assumed that beta and chi, I will change them later, but you know that these are meta variables, have the truth values under the same assignments. Thus, C also has to logically imply B. There is no situation in which C is true and B is not. See? Okay, so this is one half of mathematical proof. I use my noggin, I use my creative reasoning while using the same foundations that I just studied to provide a sequence of reasonings backed up by rigorous definitions to show that a relationship, a property relationship, I want to say property, I mean mathematical properties, not like physical properties, transfers. Okay, now the other half. Whoops. So we assume that B logically implies chi and vice versa. This means that truth assignments that make B true also make C true, and that all truth assignments that make C true also make be true. If I were to assume there were at least one truth assignment that did not give these two formulas the same value, either of those logical implications will break. If there were a situation or truth assignment that made B true and C false, B logically implying C that will enter in contradiction with B logically implying C. The other case is analog. Therefore, every truth assignment that makes B true also makes C true, which is the definition of logical equivalence. So yeah, it's very silly. Intuitively, it's obviously the case because, I mean, if A implies B and B implies A, then that means they imply each other, so that means they have to have the same values. But this exercise is not so much about the knowledge. I mean, this is the statements you are set out to prove are basic and pretty much cooked into the system. The system behaves this way because that is exactly what the people who made it set out to do. But the exercise is engaging in this kind of highly abstract thinking and writing, the experience of trying out our first mathematical proof. All mathematical proofs are in essence this. Of course, most of them are ridiculously more complex than this one. This is just for babies. This is basically us playing in the sandbox of mathematics. What just happened? Oh yeah, it's a bit lowercase. Okay. Yeah, just the experience of having to write out this weird shit is something that a lot of people struggle with, because this is not normal human communication. No one teaches us to communicate in this way. It is a very artificial, very forced way of expressing our ideas, and some people just short circuit when tasked to do this. There we go. Now it looks pretty. Let's see what's next. This type of rigorous, disciplined, very techy, very abstract thinking, I think it does the human creature a lot of good. We cannot go through life always thinking like this, but being able to think like this and to engage with subject matter that deals with spaces in which we are either right or wrong in very binary absolute terms, it does good to people. The idea that there is this abstract, impersonal arbiter of truth, yes, it is ultimately artificial, it is ultimately human made. But as a game where there are absolute answers and you can check and there is no possibility space to keep rationalizing, oh, but I wanted, but I don't, no. It's over. It's done. The proof is there. Accept it and move on. That type of mental discipline, it is great to exercise it at least every once in a while. That type of scientific rigor is something that is very politically needed. Getting used to thinking logically and having to back up our arguments and way of thinking is just a net good and applies to so much. I think this is a net good on most cases, but there are also limits. There are situations in which we are not supposed to think, but feel. Don't think, feel. We need emotional content. Basically, situations in which the immediacy of the action is absolutely necessary, such as fighting, such as the example by our great Sifu, Bruce Lee. Yeah, that is a case in which, yeah, we're not supposed to back up and think logically all the time, and we have to let it act. But I will say this. In those situations, one can only act freely and willingly after obtaining what Bruce Lee called unnatural naturalness. Fighting, dancing, and certain types of play, which require this kind of extra logical thinking, can only be done artfully once we have mastered the action through repetition and practice, through hard work, not before. And thus, I think that in order to be able to overcome thinking logically, we need to master thinking logically in the first place. And only after that, we can have that kind of spontaneous, vital, energetic, intuitive acting. Because as we saw earlier, after we did those exercises, intuition and spontaneous acting are not natural. They are not simply given. Thank you for the stretch. They are not just, they do not appear without prompting or without struggling. Effective, spontaneous, and intuitive acting is only achieved through constant practice. Let me stretch. Okay, next thing we have to prove. Show that beta and chi, again meta variables, not position letters, are logically equivalent if and only if in their truth tables the columns under B and C are the same. Well, we have defined yes, exactly, Rupert. Practicing and learning all the time and trying to see the parallels in different fields and all the things go to rust. As Bruce Lee also said, knowledge is static. It's a dead thing. Knowing, continuous knowing, is active and living. Yeah, we're processing all that indeed. Unlike logic, we are not in an unchanging environment of absolute binary truths. We have defined logical equivalence as a situation when all truth assignments that make B true also make C true. All truth assignments that make B false also make C false. A truth table is a full mapping out of every possible combination of truth assignments for a given formula. If the columns under B and C are the same, then truth assignments for both formulas match. Therefore, they have to be logically equivalent. Likewise, if they are logically equivalent, then the truth table will have to be the same for the truth table's output will have to be the same for B, beta and chi. Very simple. We just need to explain what each of these terms mean. What is logical equivalence? The situation where blah blah blah. What is a truth table? A full mapping of every possible combination of truth assignments. Once we have broken down the complex terms into their constituent simpler parts and we compare the parts, we have done a logical analysis and we have proven that these two situations are equivalent. Prove that beta and chi are logically equivalent if and only if not beta and not chi are logically equivalent. A negation is a logical connective that inverts the values it is given as input. It is a such that whenever B is true, not B is false, and vice versa. Whenever B is false, then not B is true. Thus, a negation always outputs a mirrored version of the truth assignment of the formula it is connected to. If B and C are logically equivalent, then their truth assignments match. Therefore, their negations will also match, as we have already assumed they as the negations are mere inversions. Now the negations output a mirrored inversion of the original formulas. If B is true, then C also has to be true, due to them being logically equivalent. Therefore, if B is true, not B is false, C has to be true, and not C has to be false. The truth assignments of the negations will always match, which is our definition of logical equivalence. This also proves the converse. Here, converse is the reverse. We just proved that if they are logically equivalent, then their negations are logically equivalent. So the converse will be if they are logically... Actually, no, it will not be the converse. I'm sorry. This also proves the reverse. Yeah, converse and reverse are not the same in logic. This also proves the reverse. If not V and not Chi, not beta and not Chi are logically equivalent, then V and beta and Chi must also be. And the reasoning is analog to what has been exposed. Okay, and I really wanted to go over trees today, but I don't think we have the time. But I mean, we went over a very intuitive, basic notion of mathematical proof, and that's way worth it. Insert page break. Okay, so the next exercise in the homework is, oh god, which of the following statements are logically implied by A and B? A, B, A, or B. What happens if I do this? Oh, we have some symbol collapse. Oh, well, doesn't matter because there's this page in Wikipedia that's very useful. Basically, I strongly suggest you bookmark it if you want to do logic. You want to follow along in the homeworks. D is not A or B. This is not B implies A. At this point, I can omit some of the parentheses. I trust myself to know the order of operations without explicit parentheses in every single thing. So yeah, not B implies A is equivalent to this. The extra parentheses don't tell me anything. Of course, I know that this negation is negating the B. Now this, however, this I cannot omit because this changes the order of operations. Okay, F is A if and only if B, so I need to copy G is A implies B. H is not B implies not A. It's faster, let me just do this. And I is A and not B. Oops. Okay, now the exercise is asking something very curious. What does it mean for something to be logically implied by? The formal definition is that logical implication is that every truth assignment that gives the preceding formula true also gives the logically implied formula true. Logical implication mirrors the structure of the material conditional. So one way to brute force this exercise is to check the truth table of this formula. If A and B implies A under a truth formula, then A is logically implied by A and B. This is of course intuitively correct because A and B is only true when both A and B are true. Therefore, A and B implies A. There is no possible situation in which A and B can be true and A can be false, because in order for A and B to be true, A needs to be true. A cannot be true and false at the same time. Therefore, A is logically implied by A and B. I have multiple methods to prove or reason this out. So, which of the following statement forms are logically implied by A and B? A, I just saw that yes. B, I just saw that yes, by a perfectly analog method. A and B also implies B. A or B, yes, because since A and B implies A implies A or B. If I already know that A is true, then this disjunction has to be true. I also know that B is also true, therefore A or B has to be true. Similar reasoning. I know that not A is false, but I know that B is true. And with just B alone, I know that this disjunction is true. Now, I can do truth tables for all of this, but the reasoning I am giving you is as valid and mathematically rigorous as any truth table. Let's organize this. Not B implies A. Well, I know this is true because if A is true, it cannot be the case that not B is true and A is false. I also know that not B cannot be true because B is true. So yes, this is also logically implied from A and B. A if and only if B, basically saying, does A have the same value as B? Yes, because I know that both are true. Because both are true, then they have the same value. True. A implies B, yes, because B is true. I cannot have the case where A is true and B is false because B is guaranteed by this. So basically, this one also implies this one. And because this one is implied by this one, we can concatenate this sequence of logical implications. If 1 implies 2 and 2 implies 3, then 1 also implies 3. Not B implies not A. Yes, why? Because not B is false, and therefore I don't care. And finally, does A or B imply A and not B? No, because yes, habit, bad habit. Because not B is false, therefore this conjunction is false, because conjunctions need to be true in both parts. And then Mendelssohn fucks us and says, repeat what we just did, except replace by A implies B. And it is false that A implies B respectively. Okay, let's do it quickly then. A implies B. Does A implies B imply A? No. Because there is one situation in which A implies B is true and A is false. For example, if both A and B are false, then A is false, but this is true. So it is not implied. Very similar case with this one. Die, monster, you don't belong in this chat. A or B is implied by A implies B? No, because as I said, A implies B can be true if both are false. And that assignment will give true here and false here, which is not logical implication. Not A or B is implied. We earlier proved that this and these are equivalent. Another way of saying equivalent is that one is logically implied by the other and vice versa. Both logically imply each. Not B implies A. No, that does not follow, but I need to explain why. Basically, I need to give an assignment in which this one is true and this one is false. So in order for this one to be false, I need not B to be true and A to be false. So A is false and not B is true. That means okay, got it. So in this situation, this situation is true. Sorry, this situation is false when both are false. A is false and not B is true. Not B is true when B is false. So if both are false, then this formula is false, yet this one is true. So it does not follow from one from the other. A if and only if. B, of course not. They have different truth tables. We know that in the third row of the canonical truth table, second row. In the second row of the canonical truth table, this is the third. When A is false and B is true, this is true. But this equivalence is not. Because the equivalence needs to have both values be the same. A implies B? Yes, every formula in classical logic implies itself. Not B implies not A? Yes. This is the contraposition of this. In order to prove this, I think I pretty much have to do the truth table. Fuck it, I'll do it. In fact, why am I even doing it like this? I can prove something stronger. I can prove contraposition. So true, true, false, false. True, false. True, false, which means this is true, false. True, true. So negated B is false. True. False. True. Negated A is false. False. True. True. So false implies false? Yes. False implies true? No. Your truth implies false? No. False implies true? Yes. Truth implies true? Yes. Oops. And as we can see, it is the same output as A implies B. True, false, true, true, which means that this B conditional is always going to be true, which means these two formulas are equivalent, and we can present one in the form of the other. A and not B? No, of course not. There is a situation in which this one is true and this one is false. For example, when both are false, A is false, which means the conjunction is false, yet this will be true. And now we have to do the same shit again, but with not A implies B. Now, what is the only situation in which A implies B is false? Because in order for the negation to be true, this implication is false. We did this earlier. We know that this is equivalent to A and not B. And this, it's much more intuitive to do the same exercise again. Does A follow from A and not B? Yes. Does B follow? No, we know that not B. A or B? Yes, because A is true. Not A or B? No, because neither are true. Not B implies A? Yes, because A is true. So I don't care about the antecedent. A if and only if B? No, because we know that they have different values. A is true and B is false. A implies B? Absolutely not. This is a negation. We have the opposite of that. Not B implies not A. But we just proved that this formula and this formula are equivalent, so no. If you don't follow, if G is not logically implied, then neither is H. A and not B? Yes, it is the same formula, and every formula implies itself. And we are done with homework? Okay, now we have to do the same homework all over again. Repeat exercise 1.11, but with A or B. And then A if and only if B, and not A if and only if B respectively. I don't think that's necessary. I think we are nearing the 2-hour mark. Yeah, I have 10 more minutes. Otherwise, this will be too unwieldy for YouTube. So let's leave that for the viewers if they want to do it. Okay, the book provides a very good reason why we shouldn't cover trees just yet. Let us go back to the book. A statement form that is false for all possible truth values of its statement letters is said to be contradictory. Its truth table has only F's in chat. Sorry, couldn't resist. F's in the column under the statement form. One example is A if and only if not A. Yeah, that is going to be a classical contradiction. That is saying something is true if and only if it isn't true. That is also a very intuitive, if you're stuck with it right now. That's a very mathematical, nerdy way of trying to model certain types of paradox. Such as the liar's paradox. This sentence is false. This sentence is false, it's only true when it's false, it's only false when it's true, and so on. So if it's true, it's false, it's true. Another example of a contradiction in classical propositional logic is A and not A. And because negation switches, a statement form beta is a tautology if and only if not beta is contradictory and vice versa. If we negate a tautology, we get pure falsehood. If we negate a contradiction, we get pure truth. A tautology is the mirror of a contradiction. A contradiction is the mirror of a tautology. And negation is a mirroring switch. So, yes, that tracks. A sentence in some natural language like English or in a formal theory that arises from a tautology by the substitution of sentences for all the statement letters, with occurrences of the same statement letter being replaced by the same sentence, is said to be logically true according to the propositional calculus. I really like this part. According to. Always relativizing the fact that we're not talking about truth in any meaningful sense. It's only true in the model, true according to our calculus. Such a sentence may be said to be true by virtue of its truth functional structure alone. What this means in non-nerd is that the tautological truths that propositional logic cares about, or the only truth from meaning that this logic cares about, are things that are true by the structure of what we can model through its logical connectives. An example is the English sentence. If it is raining or it is snowing, and it is not snowing, then it is raining. That is third excluded. Which arises by substitution from the tautology A or B and not B. So either burgers or pizza, but guess what? We're out of pizza. So you have to eat burgers. So, kind of intuitive. A sentence that comes from a contradictory statement formed by means of substitution is said to be logically false, according to propositional calculus. Again, a contradiction in this sense is only a contradiction when it arises from the pure combination of its logical and connectives. We do not care about truth and falsehood in a content kind of way. We don't care about the content of the words. We don't care about the claims. We are in a very abstract realm, and we are only focusing on how very abstract binary statements connect to each other by virtue of our truth functions. Okay, proposition 1.2. If beta and beta implies chi are tautologies, then so is chi. This is huge. So, what was our definition of logical implication? That every truth assignment that made beta true also makes chi true. So, if beta is a tautology, then every truth assignment makes beta true, regardless of what assignment is. And if beta implies chi is a tautology, then that means that whenever beta is true, then chi is true. But hey, beta is always true. Therefore, chi always has to be true. Let's assume otherwise. If chi took the value f false for some assignment of truth values to the statement of letters b and chi, then since beta is a tautology, beta will take the value t always, and therefore beta implies chi will have the value f for that assignment. This contradicts the assumption that beta implies chi, because we will have one case in which beta implies chi is false, but we know we can't because we assume that it's a tautology. Therefore, chi never takes the value f, and because something never takes the value f, that is a symmetric definition of tautology. Tautology can be defined as always true and never false. Now, that is only in this logic. There are other logical systems in which always being true and never being false are not synonymous. If you have, for example, a logic which models the value of unknown, basically a third value, then depending on how you arrange your system, always being true and never being false are not the same. For example, if you have a formula that is true half of the time and unknown the other half, that does not make it a tautology. That doesn't make it always true. But it does make it never false. Thanks for the hydrate. And with 1.3, proposition 1.3, we will end today's stream. If tau is a tautology containing the statement letters A1, A2, A to the n, and beta arises from tau by substituting statement forms so on for A1, A2, A to the n, respectively, then beta is a tautology, that is, substitution in a tautology yields a tautology. Example, if we imagine that tau is A1 and A2 implies A1, and that is a tautology, then we can change. Are these other logic types going to be relevant in future classes? I don't know. I don't know if I will teach non-classical logics, but I think it's always useful to warn students so they don't jump to conclusions. So they don't automatically think that it's always going to be the case that always true means the same as never false, because that is a philosophically problematic statement. I think it's just good pedagogy to explain that there's options, that there's alternatives, that this is just one way of thinking out of many. Okay, so again, because we have defined logically true as true regardless of what the content of the formula are, as long as the structure remains, then yielding, then substitution by respecting the connectives are going to yield a tautology. This is why we earlier spoke about metavariables, because with metavariables you can substitute freely. And as long as the structure remains the same, the values are going to be the same. Assume that tau is a tautology. Okay, tau is in a formula that has many terms and is a tautology. For any assignment of truth values to the statement letters in beta, the forms L1, L to the n have truth values x1, x to the n, where each x to the n is true or false. If we assign the values of x1 and so on to a1, which is the substitution, respectively, then the resulting truth value of tau is the truth value of beta for the given assignment of the truth values. Since tau is a tautology, this truth value is always true. Therefore, beta, which is the substituted form, always takes the value of t. This maybe an example might be more intuitive. For example, A or not A, to be or not to be. This is always going to be true. It doesn't matter what A is. For example, we can substitute is there a difference between is and must be? Yes. Yes, there is. In logic, it's very different. When I say is, I am mostly just declaring or describing. When I say must be, I am saying that there is a logical implication that is necessary and deductive. So for example, if I substitute A for P and Q or not P and Q, it doesn't matter what P and Q is or A is, because in the end, the structure remains constant. If one side is true, the other is false. If one side is false, the other is true. Therefore, always at least one side will have true, which means that this disjunction will also always be true. Therefore, tautologies and contradictions in classical propositional logic emerge not from the content, not from whether in this case they are true or false, and so on, but out of structural relationships within the system. And with that, I'm going to close off today's stream. If you haven't done your homework, do your homework. Remember, we are working through Introduction to Mathematical Logic, 5th edition by Elliot Mendelsohn, which I can give you a discount to buy it if you need it. And if that is not enough for you, then you can do Knight and Napes puzzles from the book What is the Name of This Book by Raymond Smullyan. Now that we have more methods to work with. Anyways, of particular importance today was this, our first baby mathematical proofs. Get used to them, they're extremely useful. They are a very rewarding faculty of the mind to exercise. We will continue with the book and we will go over 3 proofs next week. I'll see you then. Nice work, Rupert. I hope you can handle all your homeworks. No need to burn yourself out. But yeah, this was... Hey, don't worry, Rupert. That's what I'm here for. But yeah, I'm gonna do my outro now. This was Samuel, your friendly intern uncle that wants to help you get into philosophy helping you get into mathematical logic. Have an excellent time zone, everyone. See you later!